I'm here with Dr. Nicole Robinson, and I'd like to know who you are.
Yeah. Hi, good to meet you, Jacob. Happy Tuesday morning. I'm Dr. Nicole Robinson, born and raised in Milwaukee, and I wear a couple different hats in the community. Founded an organization, a nonprofit called Milwaukee Evaluation, which supports local evaluators to enhance their practice and service to the community and the benefit of social justice. That's one hat. The second hat is I'm a researcher and I focus on neighborhoods and criminal justice topics. And that's what I hope to talk more with you today. I'm also the owner of an evaluation and research planning firm that does a lot of national work with foundations, with large nonprofits that's supporting advocacy and social change. And I've been wearing those hats for the last 15, 20 years.
Wow, that's amazing. So I guess we should start off with the first question that I had, which just in general, what is gentrification?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I use a 2 point definition: displacement and replacement. So displacement means that people who have been living in the neighborhood are being forced to leave through a variety of mechanisms, sometimes eviction, sometimes higher taxes, sometimes higher rents, or buildings being torn down and remodeled. They're being forced to leave. And that can happen over generations. It can be very slow moving, which is the type of style of gentrification that you have in Milwaukee. And then we also have replacement. So that's the other side. There's so many things happening in the neighborhood that to distinguish between gentrification and racial residential segregation, just moving patterns of where families want to raise their children, all of those things can change and they change over the course of a lifetime. Some families want to live in more rural areas, others want to live in the city center. But what makes gentrification is not just that people are leaving or people are being forced out of their neighborhoods, but that there's a replacement process that happens. The replacement could be more affluent families or young professionals, singles. They're typically white residents, but they don't have to be people. Replacement could be a new stadium that's built. We saw that in Washington, D.C., with the new baseball stadium that displaced an amazing, incredible transgender community. And then the most historic, famous example of replacement involves the expansion of our highway system, which happened here in Milwaukee and throughout the country that displaced Black businesses, Black corridors, and then, of course, Black neighborhoods where you had homeowners and renters who were forced to leave as a result of federal plans to expand the highway. So gentrification is displacement, replacement. It can happen over generations. And what's really important to note that when we get to the replacement stage, that is a rapid gentrifying process. And you see that in Oakland, you see that in New York. And that is where residents will say the neighborhood changes overnight. I lived in DC during the last stage replacement, and literally the liquor store stopped selling Heineken and beer overnight and began selling rosé and other fine wines. The library was interviewing the elders of the neighborhood to understand what life was like when it was Washington, D.C., as a nickname Chocolate City, when it was a Black neighborhood. That last stage happens very quickly, and that's usually when gentrification is most visible. That's its most visible stage where you can say this is what's happening. It's very difficult to slow, stop, or do anything to mitigate the negative consequences of gentrification. And that's the last point I want to make. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, we need a little bit of gentrification. They're really saying you need a revitalization, economic investment, and we should use those terms because there really isn't a positive little bit of gentrification that's very helpful. Um, it really means people who have lived in a neighborhood that has been divested in over time. So divestment for multiple players, the government, not repairing the streets, not replanting new trees, not installing fiber optics, not removing lead pipes that are, they call it the lead laterals, pipes that provide water to our children. That's divestment. And then we have for-profit entities who are also divesting in the neighborhood. So they're building homes elsewhere and allowing the housing stock to not receive any new types of homes or diversify the housing market that exists. It's what we see that follows with divestment is increase in crime, saturation in the number of people who are below income. We see people leaving. There's huge depopulation occurring, which it feels like, people are just leaving the neighborhood. You see boarded up homes. You see homes catching on fire due to neglect. All the bad things that sort of happen, not as something separate or not as something that just happens to happen. In fact, the only way that capital can invest money into a neighborhood after a period like that is because the land has been devalued. So it's cheaper to buy lots of land very quickly and then rebuild on it. So we should see that divestment stage as part of the gentrification process, and that the displacement of people who stuck it out in the neighborhood, which is our elders, there's nothing positive. You lose political power, which I hope we get into. So just to clear that part up.
Yeah, I know. I've heard a lot about that, about how it displaces minorities and everything. And so what happens to these minorities when they get pushed out and where do they go? Because I've always wondered that. And I've always
Mhm.
wondered like how how does that affect their housing and how does that affect them?
Yeah. So you hear in public health, like this idea of like place space. One thing about you is where you're from is a huge part of your identity. I'm from the north side of Milwaukee. I'm from the south side of Milwaukee. Like there's pride in where you're from,
Yeah,
even if we have
yeah,
crime,
yeah,
streets that haven't been swept or cleaned, but we also have laughter, and you lose those ties that you had in the neighborhood. So the person that you knew who ran the corner store or who ran the gas station, it's it's not like that's recreated and you all move together. You're in a new neighborhood. And right now, with the changes in housing, the cost, people who are leaving and being displaced are not necessarily moving to better neighborhoods. In fact, they're moving to neighborhoods with similar characteristics and circumstances. So it's not like when they move,
yeah,
somehow their income levels rise, the educational outcomes improve, all these things happen. But what they do lose is that tie, that identity that is so profound. And unfortunately, with the era of climate change, this time around,
yeah,
when people move, I think that it's going to be the first move of many moves. Um, like I said, I don't think when you go to the next neighborhood that all of a sudden things are stable and
yeah,
you're set for the next several generations. I think with climate change, we're going to see a lot more people moving.
yeah,
So I think I was hearing you talk about solutions and stuff like that. So how can we prevent the gentrification from happening? Because I know it's a big problem, and I feel like a lot of people have sort of a hopelessness of it because they can't buy up the lands that the
Mhm.
gentrifiers are buying, and they can't help protect against that. So how do we prevent this from happening to our community?
yeah,
Well, the first step is recognizing that gentrification is occurring even if it's in the early stage. And so I argue in my work that
yeah,
neighborhoods like Harambe, the North Side, 53206 zip code are the next ones to be gentrified, and that we need really robust protections to make sure that we um, minimize, if not stop, the displacement of people. And I would encourage us to have the broadest notion of people, not just the homeowners, not just the elderly, but the displacement of renters and children. In my work, I also talk about the displacement of formerly incarcerated people who are left out of the market. They don't have enough money to even rent a home, much less buy a home or a home that's been boarded up and requires significant repairs, which today the costs of any type of repair requiring lumber, electricity, all of that's really, really expensive. And in my study, the men made an average of 9,000 a year. That's not enough to repair homes and take care of families and do all the things you need to do at reentry. So recognizing that that's happened, but also recognizing that right now, this is the first time gentrification is occurring in the era of mass incarceration, where you have a new group of people, almost 13% of the population, who are for displacement due to having a criminal history and being under the supervision of the Department of Corrections. That's other eras of gentrification in the 1950s, 1930s did not have that. They had Jim Crow, they had similar, but they did not have that.
Yeah.
The other thing that's new is gentrification as a result of climate change. We're next to, in the city of Milwaukee, next to 20% of the world's fresh water.
Yeah.
They're referring to the Great Lakes city as climate havens and
Yeah.
climate resistance. We're not experiencing hurricanes. We're not experiencing droughts or wildfires as much. But the other thing is that we are, because we're considered a climate haven, there's climate migration.
Yeah.
So areas that will be underwater, like the Gulf Coast, that will be experiencing fires, those people will be looking for places to live. And so the city of Milwaukee is one place. And there's talks now that the city of Milwaukee is already like preparing with the new housing that they're developing. As we're thinking about like stopping gentrification and specifically the displacement part, thinking about how do we accept the people who will be displaced without further displacing the people who already lived here. And we can see from the development of luxury apartments
Yeah.
downtown that the first people who will get to live in this so-called climate haven will be wealthy people, will be affluent people. And my concern in terms of what's happening downtown is that
Yeah.
the tallest building downtown with the greatest number of Black occupancy is MSDF, which is the vertical prison that's right by I-94. It looks like an apartment building, but it has 400 people where the majority of those people are Black. And
Yeah.
with all the development downtown, that is a real shame for the city to actually have as a part of its landscape and makeup. Uh, what's also happening around the globe is something called large scale land acquisition.
Yeah.
So gentrification happening now, and specifically in relationship to climate change, has nothing to do about bringing people to get next to and 5-minute driving distance from the beach, from Pfizer Forum, from other things happening downtown. It has more to do with the most powerful among us within the political and economic class. I refer to them as the elite class, for them to basically set up for generations access to natural resources, not assets.
Yeah.
So we sometimes think of them as assets
Yeah.
that they will need to survive. So water's used in manufacturing, it's used in trade, it's used to create things. It's not just used for drinking water, watering your grass and things like that. And the men in my study often said, I'm thinking about survival today. It's very hard for me to stop gentrification. And
Yeah.
this is something that they named by name
Yeah.
and work on that when I'm trying to feed my children. I'm trying to make sure we have housing. And one of the men who I interviewed, he was sleeping in a car. It's very hard to fight gentrification when you're at that level. And his kids were like super, super cute, super amazing. And it broke my heart to interview someone where it's the city's
Yeah.
housing defines like affordability as someone who makes 33,000 or a household that has 33,000 when the men in my study were hoping to find lodging for $20 a night. And so we have to know that it's happening, why it's happening, and that gentrification is a system.
Yeah.
Lots of different actors within government, within philanthropy, within for profit.
Yeah.
We also have to know that to stop it, we have to have a very robust goal where we're fighting for something versus against something. So I really caution people against against fighting against gentrification, but really fighting to preserve their neighborhood. And so in the case of northern Milwaukee, preserving Black land.
Yeah.
And there's so many amazing things that come from that because one, we're no longer thinking about neighborhoods as just housing. and housing specifically for homeowners. We're thinking about all the different people who need housing, whether they're renters, whether they're students who are just coming in, whether they're travelers. But we're also thinking about what makes up a neighborhood. So the gas station owner, the corner store, the marketplace, the informal economy, all those things. And so I actually think like a reconstruction 2.0 is our better bet, and thinking of rethinking and imagining businesses
Yeah.
and thinking about them in terms of what do we need for the future if climate change, if we're not like
Yeah.
resilient enough to handle climate change. So thinking about not having our storefronts filled with consumable goods and thinking of residents just as consumers, but actually thinking about what would the residents need. Is that a lumber yard inside of North Side Milwaukee that's Black owned, Black run? Is it a solar energy power on the south side for Latinos? Latinos nationally are like 21% of the renewable energy workforce. What would that mean if we actually invested in that type of business versus that storefront
Yeah.
selling clothes, selling baked goods, but actually inserted us into the supply chain in a real way, and a supply chain that actually makes the future better? And so I do think that
Yeah.
once we know what's happening, why it's happening, really rethinking our economic system and thinking about how the neighborhoods facilitate and support that. Lots of things are impacted. Gentrification feeds on other things that are happening in the neighborhood. It feeds on school closures. It feeds on other sort of more exploitive processes that are happening in the neighborhood. And to fight it, you really have to reimagine what would we do differently
Yeah.
to recreate a society where we all had access to clean water, where we all had safe housing, where we all had safe roads and things like that.
What are the signs of gentrification when it's first coming about? Because I think a lot of people it goes unnoticed when these things happen, when these things pop up, and then all of a sudden it seems like overnight that it happened, but it's been actually building over a couple years. And so, what are the signs of gentrification?
So in my study, they talked about community gardens.
Yeah.
And community gardens, the literature, and even some of our local universities said, that they're supposed to increase this idea of collective efficacy, people in the neighborhood solving problems together. And that by itself is supposed to decrease crime. Those two things are usually coupled together. You usually see when one goes up, the other goes down. So when people work together, when you know your neighbors, crime goes down. The challenge with when we look at what gardens represent in areas that have been divested in, that they don't necessarily solve the food drought or food insecurity problem. And that in the gentrification literature, gardens signal that the land might be ready for reinvestment. And just in the process of building a garden, there's soil samples, there's just a lot more information that is being collected about the neighborhood that ends up being used to support and a reinvestment strategy. There's surveys around who's in the neighborhood, and the gentrification literature actually says
Yeah.
philanthropy, for example, learns what institutions exist and are homegrown and starts building relationships with those in ways that don't facilitate the
Yeah.
needs and identity of the neighborhood, but actually facilitates the needs of the philanthropic
Yeah.
entities. And so community gardens point to one. Milwaukee had a huge wave where lots of gardens were placed throughout the city that never sort of lived up to their promise, but they were invested in. And the men in my study had some pretty, harsh critiques around what those gardens meant, and that they weren't doing enough to in terms of the level of investment. We also see repairing our roads, installing bike lanes. The men in my study, yes, they would ride the bike, and but their greatest transportation need was that the larger manufacturing companies are located in Oak Creek or outside the city limits that buses take a long time to get to. And if you have children, it's very difficult to bus out there for to work an 8-hour shift. And what if you have to get home to pick up your kid from daycare or school? And so establishing bike lanes really just signals we're not
Yeah.
um, preparing the roads for the existing transportation use of the existing residents, but for future residents, maybe bike to work. And in fact, that's what my men said. They were like, "There's no white people here, but they will bike through the neighborhood."
Yeah.
You see luxury stores, juice, coffee shops that are not
Yeah.
owned by anyone in the neighborhood, that are not Black owned, will also signal investment. You see the selling off of lots of city owned properties to developers, is an example of, that it's coming. Increase in taxes, even ever slightly, is will signal that it's coming as well.
And so how has history shown gentrification?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. There are a lot of different styles. And so the example that I was sharing with you around establishing the bike lanes is referred to as green gentrification. So this idea of selling a healthy lifestyle, um, that also increases the taxes and the cost of living in the neighborhood to the point where the residents who are already living there can't afford to stay or are pushed out.
Yeah.
So your landlord doesn't renew your lease. The building goes under extensive renovation, and you are forced to leave.
Yeah.
Or you see your um, neighbor leave, and it doesn't feel like the same neighborhood anymore. In my study, I looked at whether gentrification was causing more rearrests and reincarcerations, and I found that in the late stage of gentrification, you're 3.4 times more likely to be reincarcerated. So you're not leaving to go to another neighborhood, you're leaving to be sent back to prison. And I think that's a very different style. And one of the things that we have to pay attention to as gentrification occurs for the first time in the era of mass incarceration. There are lots of different styles
Yeah.
of evictions, and or not just displaced. I'm sorry, there are lots of those different styles of displacement.
Yeah.
Depending on who you are, you're more vulnerable to certain types. And that's why I think you're pointing out that gentrification looks different depending on where you are in history and who you are in that time frame. So if I'm a homeowner,
Yeah.
I'm not vulnerable to evictions, but I am vulnerable to higher property taxes. I am vulnerable to code violations and the expenses that you want me to take care of as a senior with limited income on my 100-year-old home that I've been living in for 50, 70 years, and I've raised my children and my grandchildren here. I am vulnerable to that. As renter, I am vulnerable to evictions, as I mentioned before. I'm vulnerable to higher rent increases. I'm also vulnerable to what happens in the late stage are calls for service.
Yeah.
And so where the police are called because they hear loud noise, they see people partying. And so that happens. You see that a lot in Oakland of people who have always had their music loud, all of a sudden are having calls for service, like where the police are knocking on their door saying, uh, your music's too loud, here's a ticket, here's a fine. And that makes life unlivable and difficult. And in the era of mass incarceration, depending on what else is happening, that could be one way that that individual or the people around them end up becoming involved in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
It's
And
almost like stop and frisk, but during gentrification.
Yeah.
can you speak more on that connection to mass incarceration and to gentrification? Because I know there's probably a link to that.
So those calls are referred to as like quality of life calls. Y- The homeless, for example, will be at risk for those calls. Someone sleeping on a park bench, someone sleeping on the streets, the police will be called and will ask those individuals to move. I think the country right now is debating whether that's even an ethical practice, whether that's a human rights violations to arrest someone who has nowhere to go and say that they can't live there, but that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And so the quality of life can sometimes even be kids playing at the park, can be a dog barking, can be a family that because they cannot afford to live separately, you have maybe 10 individuals living in a home, and those 10 individuals have 5 cars, and they've decided to park those cars on the front lawn or in the vacant lot next to them. So all of a sudden, there's calls for police, there's tickets issued, there's confrontation, there's background checks. So it's a little bit like stop and frisk, except someone's calling on you, and then it becomes a thing. And if the police notice, for example, a code violation, and you are a renter, then the landlord gets that ticket. And most landlords don't want tenants who are bringing attention to their home that
Yeah.
requires extensive tens of $1,000s in repairs. So they'd rather evict that person or work on evicting them, not renew their lease, and then they're moved out of the neighborhood and displaced that way. So yeah, gentrification levies a lot of different harmful practices inside of communities, and it will levy in the beginning stage the loss of people. So I mentioned before, depopulation occurs in these neighborhoods. In the era of mass incarceration, depopulation is occurring because we have so many Black men on the north side of Milwaukee leaving and being uh, Todd Fair refers to it as coercive mobility. So it's not that they're moving to another neighborhood; they're being forced out of the neighborhood and being free incarcerated. We have so many that's been discussed extensively. Where like 13% of the population, one aldermanic district, 15% of another, where this has happened to. And then on the late stage in my research, where it's very difficult to get back to a neighborhood that's already gentrified, and then once you do, your risk of reincarceration is that much higher because police are very quick to respond.
And then I wanted to circle back on the climate change and the speak on the connection that about how climate change actually is affecting gentrification. Can you
Mhm.
expand more on that idea? Because I did not know that until you brought it up, and I never
Mhm.
really thought about that. And so there are obviously many factors that go into gentrification and the different problems that we have in the world right now. So can you explain that connection, that like between
Mhm.
climate change and gentrification?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have a colleague, a former client of mine, Taproot, and who's working in New Orleans, and who's recognizes that the future of her people, the survival of her people, means that they are going to have to relocate from the Gulf Coast area. That's just every forecast says it will be underwater, it will be uninhabitable, and it will be experiencing extreme weather circumstances. And her colleagues are saying we're going to have to move to other, into the state. We're not going to be able to live on the coast. They actually named Milwaukee as one of the cities where they have said some of the houses that are being built are being built because they know we're coming in the near future, in 20 years, in 30 years. And it's not just we, like people who are displaced due to one storm, it's going to be entire families, entire neighborhoods. So that's the climate migration. The second thing is you have developers, philanthropy, and even the government in Milwaukee
Yeah.
referring to Milwaukee as the fresh coast. So you have the West Coast, East Coast, and you have Milwaukee as the fresh coast. So they are actually saying and naming that Milwaukee's water resources is an untapped commodity. And we should be very concerned about fresh water being treated as a commodity. It is a right for all of us to have access to clean water to drink and use to clean things. It's very important. We learned in COVID to wash our hands. It's very important to have water for our crops, and also we use it to build things and create things.
Yeah.
We need to think about the people who live in Milwaukee as people who could be water protectors. There should be a natural relationship between those who are displaced and those who want to ensure that water and the beach and lake access and all those things to the fish that are in that lake that you could eat are accessible to everyone, not just based on whether you have enough money and things like that. So there's just a lot at stake this time around in the gentrification process. And politically, this is,
Yeah.
A presidential election year. This should be a not just mass incarceration, but climate change, but gentrification in the city of Milwaukee as well. When we think about how important Wisconsin is to the election and how important the city of Milwaukee is in terms of even the electoral votes, we are a major political player.
Yeah.
And with displacement, we diffuse our political power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the context of climate change,
Yeah.
protecting Lake Michigan, even protecting Waterworks, which is a nonprofit organization, those two things
Yeah.
are saved by the residents, and residents would have to vote away their rights, vote away those protections. And so, who lives here and their history and relationship to the land matters. And I would argue that those who have been here have a deep connection and commitment and a political power that we wouldn't want to lose. And so that's
Yeah.
something that if you were to displace people and new people were to come in, it'd be easier to remove those protections for the water, remove those, even that concept that water should be protected and change it into a commodity. It'd be easier to do that with people who don't have a long history of thinking about water as like something that's just available.
Yeah.
We don't question turning on the shower and running it to get the temperature we want.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I never really thought about how displacement and people moving in would really affect that political shift as well. Because I know, and then when it comes to like water and the protection of it, I think us as native or native,
Mhm,
Wisconsinites or
mhm.
Milwaukeeans, they understand that the lake and how important it is to our everyday to day, and I didn't realize that, oh, like
Yeah.
other states won't recognize the precious how we view the Lake Michigan, how we view the Great Lakes and stuff like that. So I've never thought about that. So thank you. Um, and so then, how can we use our voice as just members of our communities? How can we use our voice so we can instill those protections against gentrification or just in general?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that there's a real opportunity for us to be ahead of the game and actually take a stand. Sorry, you can hear my puppy in the background. I think we can take a stand,
Yeah.
and we have to be clear on preserving the land and who's been living on the land. And I think that
Yeah.
we need to understand that you cannot engineer a
Yeah.
melting pot. You cannot engineer multiple classes mixing together. This country has been around for hundreds of years. It has never been able to successfully do that. I don't think that what they're promising now in terms of luxury condos will trickle down into jobs. The men in my study had gun violence, robbery. They will not be hired at these new shops. They will not be allowed to walk into those new shops. They were already
Yeah.
being contained and corralled in their neighborhoods. If they tried to go to the lake for a date to walk along uh, the beach, we had Sheriff Clark who would often pull people to the side and say, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" and make it uncomfortable that people didn't want to go. So my men to in my study to be able to go to a very affluent area and kind of move through it as if there wasn't an issue, that's when you get the reincarceration. If they have anything on them, if they haven't checked in with their PO, things like that, we can't engineer those things. No city has ever done it with this plan of building up luxury homes, trying to create like multicultural communities. It just doesn't work. And so that's why I do argue that protecting and preserving Black land in particular, doing a Reconstruction 2.0 and rethinking like what our economic system is and what neighborhood life is like, that's actually the opportunity in front of us. It's not to continue the status quo of disinvestment. We want revitalization dollars, but we just have to use them in ways that support long term
Yeah.
growth and thriving families and communities.
Yeah.
Two things that I think will stop us. The first is
Yeah.
people who
Yeah.
are low income, maybe inherited the home from their grandmother,
Yeah.
will be inclined to sell.
Mhm.
It's the first real money that they've had in generations.
Yeah.
And I think we have to make a strong case to them of making a commitment to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money that they'll probably get. They probably will be able to find another home that they can purchase. But we have to recognize this is a lot of money, and our homes generally don't have equity in them. They're usually, because the neighborhood has been devalued, your home pre-gentrification's worth 30 grand. After gentrification, it's worth 200,000. But you're not able to borrow that the future amount. You've just been given this. And so you haven't been able to leverage the equity in your home for homework prayers, for college education, for a car. So right now, people will be solicitors. I think I've gotten 2 calls today from people who want to purchase my property
Yeah.
and for money.
Yeah.
That would be great. Like, so we have to recognize that there's this, like, if I haven't seen money in my family in generations, someone offering to buy my home now is a real compelling
Yeah.
offer. On the flip side, the Black middle class.
Yeah.
I just was at Marquette University and I was looking at they have the Black middle class in Milwaukee exhibit, and there was a person that they were featuring who said money, you
Yeah.
don't need money for success and happiness. And I would argue that yes,
Yeah.
when my mother serves me coffee,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
When my father makes me a hamburger, when my nephews laughed and chuckled like a real belly laugh as a baby for the first time, like that was happiness. She is right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we also live in a world where money buys you food. Money buys you an education, it buys you housing. And until we have cooperatives and collective, institutions and land trusts and things like that, we still need money. And so I need the Black middle class to not view this gentrification from their lens of as homeowners, as people who do clean up the neighborhood, who sweep their garbage, and who um, you know,
Yeah.
don't have to run an extension cord from their house to the others to get electricity. I need them to see this in a way where they have to be allies and not side with gentrifiers and developers and philanthropy, but actually side with the people who might be displaced and who are most vulnerable to displacement, which it will be not just our elderly or our homeless, but it's also our formerly incarcerated people, people who I would say the middle class is probably frustrated with the harm and violence, the shootings, the homicide, the robberies. That is very frustrating to wrap your arm around and bring that resident into the fold, but we absolutely need them. And so that's going to be really key. So it's 2 groups we have to recognize and honor their experiences and actually speak to them directly about those things so that they're on our side and that we have a greater chance of taking a stand against, not against gentrification, but taking a stand for the preservation of Black land.
And so, how do we go about educating people so they understand what gentrification is and how it affects them? How do we educate them, even in the community, minority communities? Because I know a lot of people actually don't understand what gentrification is. And in my class, we talk about gentrification, and a couple of my classmates didn't know who they were, and they were minorities. And so, how do we go about educating these people, and not just minorities, but white people? How do we educate them as well, to because I think they think they are doing something good, that they're providing a service to the community, when in fact they're pushing our their community members out. So how do we go about educating them?
Mhm. Yeah, as you can see, it's really complex. I hear over and over, it's like, well, we're not displacing anyone. That land was vacant. It's like, well, that was early displacement. They were already displaced by the time you got there. That's what makes gentrification hard to identify in River West. River West was already gentrified. That was a strong Latino neighborhood, Puerto Rican specifically, Italian, Black. They were all given money to go live on like 90th and Capitol in the 70s. So unless 40, 50-year history, you wouldn't know that River West was not a white affluent neighborhood, but a Black and brown neighborhood. And there's a little bit where you could see with the Italian bakery. You can tell by the style of homes that the immigrants there were Polish, like with no front porches. That you could tell from the architecture, like who's been there over time. And so it is really complex. It is really confusing. And I think that we have 10 years before we get to that rapid gentrification stage with replacement, where it changes overnight. We have 10 years. So 2034 is what I'll call it. We can't educate people for the next 10 years because it's going to happen by the time we talk to everybody.
Yeah.
What we learned in mass incarceration is that the panels, the meetings, the national expert, the global expert, all of that didn't change and end mass incarceration in Milwaukee. So we shouldn't follow that playbook here of the slow moving. I think when the education happens, it needs to be strategizing and bringing people in, as opposed to a very academic way of like walking people through all the literature and all the experts. That is a distraction. That is a slow way to kind of that's a assured way to absorb energy
Yeah.
for people who want to work on it. But it's a slow way to actually get the information out. I would say that in the case of gentrification, unlike any other topic,
Yeah.
local residents know it's happening and know what it is. They just don't have the full picture of the community gardens contributing to it, the bike lanes contributing to it, um, they know that evictions might be a part of it, but evictions predate gentrification, so they might not get those connections. But we really need to think about what is the solution and educating people on solutions as opposed to educating them on the problems, because we could spend the next 10 years doing that. And this is a time limited or time sensitive problem. Once it happens, there's no reversing gentrification. It's a done deal. And in the case of climate change being next to a large source of fresh water, it will be the most permanent gentrification you will ever see. It'll never go back in generations. So we need protections that go out 100 years. We need evaluators like myself. I mentioned I wear a couple different hats in the community. We need to be reading contracts, all those protections, the quotas of, it'll be market-based rents, for the next 35 years, those should be extended to 100 years. We need attorneys reading all the fine print. In other cities, they said there's loopholes. The landlords are able to get out of those regulations. Washington, D.C. has the most robust protections where tenants are allowed to buy the building before the landlord is able to sell it. We don't have that here. They can't even stop gentrification. They cannot. And so we really have to not be distracted by doing things that don't work. And so I think the education has to be around bringing people into a solution and not approaching it as like we're going to educate the city with like a class in a series. They did that with mass incarceration and nothing changed. No one was held accountable to serious changes.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that's basically it for me. But do you have anything else to say? Anything you had on your mind that you wanted to speak about? Or
I think that, I mean, I love everything that Five Points neighborhood has been doing around this topic so far, and I really appreciate that you brought me on. I hope it's helpful. I do think in terms of like Latino gentrification, which is happening on the south side of Walker's Point, it looks different and requires a different conversation just because of the neighborhood makeup. It's a little bit harder to track Latinos. They're still in a lot of surveys listed as white. And so then you have to like identify Hispanic, yes. And no, it's like the data.
yeah,
But I think it's really important that we recognize that there are one, the value of cultural enclaves and preserve those. It's so totally okay, especially in the era of racial equity and DEI, but also recognize that different groups, racial and ethnic groups, are vulnerable to gentrification in different ways. So we didn't even get to really talk much about the Latino experience in Milwaukee, but that certainly deserves a conversation. They, as Southsiders, are definitely in the early, late stages of replacement. You can see it in terms of just the feel of the South Side close to downtown, You can the sounds of it, and that's a real loss for Milwaukee. And what we gain in terms of affluent residents who pay higher taxes, we lose, and what makes the South Side like an experience for everyone. I do have a project site called Black Neighborhoods near Freshwater. Well, I'll post talks that I'll be giving and other resources and things along the way that I can make sure I get you the URL for.
Yeah, please do so. But yeah, I think that's it. So thank you so much
Awesome.
for educating me because I learned so many new things here and it was amazing.
Awesome. It's good to connect with you. Thank you.
Mhm.